I'm a firm believer that with time and skill, one could make virtually anything in 3D. But, as I'm sure you guys have pondered, not everything in the world is made up of perfect spheres, boxes, cylinders, and the like. In fact, almost nothing in the real world is, and you'd have a hell of a time making a sweet-looking sci-fi loading dock, for instance, with a bunch of primitives. So, how do we make the custom geometric shapes we want then? Well, we have to access and modify the vertices, edges, and faces that make up these primitives. These components are accessed in Max by going into sub-object mode, and we have hundreds of tools at our disposal to shape and modify these subcomponents in various ways. So before we start making our frying pan, let's learn a bit about sub-object mode. Now, when we make a primitive in Max, we have what we might call a procedurally generated mesh. For instance, when we make a box, the program is actually thinking about this geometry as a box that has 6 sides, 3 straight dimensions, right angles, and such. You'll see over in our Modify tab that we have a list of parameters that define this box, and we can change them. Control over these parameters can be useful sometimes. Well, suppose we wanted to make this box into something that was not a box at all, a more custom shape, like a house for instance. To do this, we need to convert this box to an editable poly by simply right-clicking on it and saying Convert to Editable Poly. Now Max is not thinking about this box as a box. To Max, this object is now just 4 verts, or points in space, connected by 6 faces. And to access its subcomponents, we make sure that we're in the Modify tab, this little blue rainbow thing, and then click on this plus sign next to Editable Poly. We can now click on these components, and whichever one we have enabled will allow us to select and modify that particular type of component. You'll notice that everything we learned back in object mode is still applicable in sub-object mode, like all of our gizmos, our selection tools. We can select 2 verts with a marquee and rotate them. We can go into polygon mode and grab entire faces and move them around. We can scale them. It's important to note though that after you do convert it to an editable poly, although you'll have all of this custom control over the shape of your mesh and you'll actually start being able to model it, you will lose all of those procedural parameters that you get on a standard box. You'll notice that now in the Modifier tab we have all these crazy tools that have replaced our parameters, and these tools can help us model, and they all do various things. Let's learn a couple. Let's make that house I was talking about. So if you wanted to make a simple house from a box, well, first we have to delete this mess which I've made inside my scene. However, if I press delete now, all it does is delete my faces. If I select all of my faces with Control A and press delete, well, it looks like I've deleted my object, but I actually haven't. It's still there. It just is an object that has no components. So when you want to delete your object and you're in sub-object mode, be sure you click back on Editable Poly again, the parent, to get you back into object mode if you want to delete an object. Also, you'll notice that if we have another object in our scene, any old object here, and we are in sub-object mode of a different object, we won't be able to select the other object. We certainly won't be able to access subcomponents of the other object. So if we want to select that object or model on that object, you're going to have to make sure, and it's very important, to climb back up to object mode from sub-object mode before you can select the other one. When you are in sub-object mode of an object, it's like that's all Max sees and the rest of the world is inaccessible to you. Just be really aware of that. So let's wipe our entire scene by climbing up back to Editable Poly and marqueeing around both of our objects and just deleting them. So to make a simple house from a box, I'm just going to create a simple box and then immediately right click on it and convert it to an editable poly. Don't click on any of these others. Editable poly is the one we want. Editable mesh is a legacy thing that was the standard a long time ago, and the other ones are something entirely different. So now that it's an editable poly, we can go into polygon mode and select this top face here. Now let's learn arguably the most basic tool in 3D, and that is extrude. So when we click on extrude, you'll notice it pops in blue and we go into extrude mode. Just like in creation mode, when we click on box, it locks us into box creation mode. So now we're in extrude mode, and anytime we try to click on something in our scene, it's going to perform an extrusion. And an extrusion is simply what it sounds like. It extrudes our face out. Now, I'm going to actually show us our what's called a wireframe. And to do that, you can press F4. And to give you a better indication of what extrude does, I'm going to extrude this face. And you can see that it extrudes the particular face out. And well, it does exactly what you see. You can select multiple things, multiple faces for instance, and then click on extrude. And you'll see it'll extrude your entire selection if you click and drag on your selection. Now, to get out of extrude mode, as I previously did a second ago, you can press Q and that will get you back into selection mode. You can also, if you've extruded, right click. Right click will get you out of most things in Max. So I'm going to undo all of that by just pressing Control Z. That's probably something I should have mentioned a lot earlier to you guys. Control Z is undo, just like most Windows programs. So I'm going to undo all the way back to this point, and I'm going to extrude just a little bit. Now this is going to be like the roof of our house, and to make it the roof of our house, I'm going to go into vertex mode and select these two verts with my control click. So I select the first vert and then control click on the second vert to select it in addition. You can also marquee around these verts, but just keep in mind that a lot of times if you marquee around stuff in sub-object mode, you might accidentally get stuff you don't want, like behind where you're trying to select. For instance, if I try to select this one vert and I look, I've actually selected more than I bargained for. So I'm just going to use control click, and I'm going to use this tool called collapse. And it's here under edit geometry. And when we click it, you'll notice that our two verts merged into one vert. And that's what collapse does. It takes your whatever selection you have and just kind of merges it all together. So if we had selected all of these verts and press collapse, you'll see that it just kind of collapsed them all together. So now we can select these two back verts here and press collapse again. And now we have a little house shape. But this house is boring. Let's make a frying pan. The pan we're going to be making is going to look something like this. I chose this pan specifically because it has a simple handle, which won't be too confusing as our first model here. So I'm going to start with the actual pan part, and I'm going to start with a cylinder. Just drag it out from the center here. Now, before we convert this thing to an editable poly, we want to make sure that all of its parametric stuff is correct, because once we convert it to an editable poly, all will be lost. So if we press F4, we see that we have a bunch of cuts here. They're called height segments, and we don't necessarily want those the way we're going to be modeling this. So we can just turn that to 1. Sometimes when you're making a model, you may have use for those extra cuts it gives you, but not in this case. And it's pretty easy to add them should you decide that you want them back, even after you've converted it to an editable poly. So another thing about our cylinder is it's not quite smooth enough. So I'm just going to go ahead and increase our amount of sides until I think it's smooth. 24 looks to be pretty good. Now keep in mind that the higher this number is, the smoother it will look, obviously, the more cylindrical it will appear. However, every polygon we add has a certain expense on the hardware of our computer. So the more polygons we have, the more difficult it is going to be for our computer hardware to render all of these polygons and calculate how the light is hitting them and whatnot. So we do have to be conscious of how many of these polygons we're using, and we generally want to go with as few polygons as we can get away with of course it's still looking good. And we have to be especially conscious of this in video game development and making assets for a game engine, because in video games we render things in real time. So the hardware limitations are a lot more rigorous than they would be if we were, say, working on something for film that will be rendered and eventually turned into 2D pixel information. So now we're ready to turn this into an editable poly. So we simply right click on it and say convert to editable poly. Now I'm just going to click on our little plus sign and go into polygon mode. So this is kind of the very base of our pan. Imagine where it touches the actual fryer, and we're gonna extrude this base out to become the entire hull of our pan here. So the first thing I'm gonna do is scale this up. And now we just kind of want to extrude this up in multiple segments and gradually shape the hull of our pan. So I'm going to use the extrude tool and just extrude it up a touch, and then click R to go into scale mode. Now is as good a time as ever to show you guys the bevel tool, which is kind of like extrude's cousin. Bevel can basically do everything extrude can do and more. It just basically gives us one more step. We do a normal extrusion just like any other extrusion, except when we let go, we have one more step. It's kind of like the box when you drag out the footprint. Right when you let go, it lets you define the height. Well, now right when we let go, it lets you define a taper to our extrusion, which will be a pretty useful tool for making this pan, since every single one we make is going to have a bit of a taper. And we click to finalize the bevel. So there we have it. We have the whole. And now I'm looking at our pan and thinking that it's a little too shallow. I want our pan to be a little deeper. So that's very easy to do. If we just jump back up to editable poly mode and go into, scale mode, we can easily just scale it up a little, and that will yield us a deeper pan. To make this pan actually have a hollowed out part, we could very well continue to bevel and then bevel all the way inward. We could do that. We would want to start with this tool called inset, which does just what it sounds like. It just insets a selection. So I'll show you an example of a crazy selection, and it does this pretty well. So even if we had a weird selection like this and we said inset, it would kind of create a little extrusion, except it would just get smaller instead of actually going outward. If that makes any sense, which it probably doesn't, but you can see what it does. And now we can use our bevel tool to just bevel this inward and hollow us out a pan here. But there is an easier way to do this. This will also be a good opportunity to show you guys modifiers. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and revert our pan to as it was before our inset. And then I'm going to select this very top face here, this big old one, and simply delete it. Now we have a hollowed out pan, but of course it has no thickness to it. It's like a pan that's made out of a piece of razor thin paper. So to give it some thickness, we can climb back to editable poly to object mode, and we have these things called modifiers. And modifiers are things that you add onto your editable poly that will, well, modify it. So we have all different ones that do all kinds of different things. And the one I'm thinking of for this particular task is one called shell. And it's a common one that I use a lot, and it's a really cool one. So you simply open up this drop down, and there's a whole ton of them, and you can type a letter to automatically move you to the modifiers that start with that letter to make it easier, and just click on the one you want, obviously. So you see that shell actually gave our paper thin mesh some thickness. And we have some parameters here which we can mess around with if we want it thicker or thinner. We can also just set this to 0 and thicken it in the other direction, which is pretty cool. And that's probably a much faster way than actually beveling inward. It'll also result in a cleaner hollowed out portion because we're not just eyeballing our bevels, and the thickness throughout our pan will be consistent, if that sort of thing matters. So I suppose now is as good a time as ever to show you guys smoothing groups. Now you'll notice if we press F4 to hide our wireframe, you will notice that we have these facets in our pan. We can very clearly see where the polygons are. Yet if we look at this segment that came with the cylinder, it's perfectly smooth. We can't see at all where the polygons are. And that is due to these things called smoothing groups. This row of polygons has it, and this one doesn't. So without smoothing groups, every polygon will be hard and faceted. So I'll demonstrate with a cylinder here. If we draw a cylinder, and we convert this cylinder to an editable poly, and we grab this top polygon here and do an extrude on it, you'll notice that even though if we press F4 we have the same exact number of subdivisions, this top one here is faceted. So to make it smooth, we need to scroll all the way down in our tool column, all the way down to these little Minesweeper looking numbers. These are our smoothing groups. So you'll notice if we select some of these polygons down where it's smooth, we have this 4 popped in. If we select these polygons where it's not smooth, we don't have any numbers popped in. If we click on one of these numbers, any of them will do, and we turn off wireframe, you'll see that it became smooth. So if we wanted to smooth them all, we would simply select all of these polygons, and we could assign them a smoothing group. Well, you'll also notice that now we can't see the line that divides the top of our cylinder from the sides of our cylinder. It all looks completely smooth, despite the fact that it's a 90-degree angle. Well, that's because the top of our cylinder is also in smoothing group 1. So we have the side of our cylinder in smoothing group 1 and the top in smoothing group 1, and what 3D Studio Max is doing is it's interpolating the shading. It's kind of like making a gradient between these two polygons and making it appear smooth. If we wanted to get rid of that facet, we would have to select these polygons and put them into a different smoothing group, something other than 1. Any other smoothing group will do. So in a lot of cases, we can simply select our entire mesh and just say clear all, which will of course make our entire mesh faceted. And then we can click this little auto smooth button, which has an angle threshold next to it. And we can just give it an angle, and that will automatically assign smoothing groups to our polygon based on how large the angle between them are. So since this angle is greater than 45 degrees, which is actually what was showing here when we pressed auto smooth, it divided these polygons into different smoothing groups. Since the angle between these two polygons, for instance, was less than 45 degrees, it put them in the same smoothing group. So that will do the job a lot of the time. Now in the case of our pan, all we really need to do is select it and go into polygon mode. And you'll notice that our shell has disappeared, and that's because this modifier, this window is called the modifier stack. And there's a certain order that things occur in the stack. So when we have polygon selected, we're actually below when the shell happens. If we want to see the entire stack all the way through, regardless of what level we are at, we can click on show end result here, and then we'll be able to edit our mesh even while we're visualizing the entire stack. But in this case, we don't really need that. And I'm just going to press Control A to select all and put all of these polygons. Well, I'm going to clear all because I notice we have some smoothing groups here. That's when the number is gone, that means that there are some polygons in your selection that are using those smoothing groups. And we just want to clear all and put them into smoothing group 1. And now the whole thing will be smooth, and when we jump back up to shell, everything will be dandy. And that is because since shell is happening after the editable poly, it automatically sets up this smoothing group for the lip here. So now we have a nice smooth pan. We do have these little black darkening spots if we're using Max 2012 or later, but that's simply because of the screen space ambient occlusion that comes default in the viewport, and it's nothing to worry about. So our pan part is complete. Now we can move on to the handle.